Good morning and welcome to the WellMed Charitable Foundation Caregiver Teleconnection. We have an expert speaker this morning who's going to talk to us about a topic that is so near and dear to my heart and is so important for caregivers. I'm an old hospital social worker, so I can tell you when I got called to the emergency room what he's talking about, which is how family members can cope with sudden caregiving, is something that's you need to know about and you need to plan for. And it's just incredibly important. If somebody has a stroke, your whole life changes, their whole life changes, your whole family life changes. So, Dr. Jacobs, please introduce yourself and begin your presentation.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, and thank you all for being here. We are a small group today, which means that we will have the opportunity to really speak to one another, share ideas, and learn from one another. I like to make this as much of a dialogue as possible because, as I just said a few moments ago, I think that's what makes this most fun for me and hopefully fun for you. So a little bit about my professional background and then my personal background. So I am a psychologist. I live and work outside of Philadelphia, PA. We were just talking about how it's a little nippy. It was a little nippy here this morning in the 30s, but it's the temperatures come up nicely into the 60s, and it's a beautiful fall day. A lot of sunshine, colored leaves, and wouldn't have it any other way. Hope your October is nice wherever you are. I also am a healthcare consultant for a big national healthcare consulting firm called Health Management Associates, where I work with states and insurance companies on helping them help caregivers do a better job. And then I do have a clinical practice besides. I also, don't come by this topic just randomly. I mean, I've been a caregiver several times in my life. Was most recently for my mother who had dementia, as well as my stepfather who had dementia. But my first experience with caregiving was really what is the inspiration for today's presentation, and that is when I was 14 years old. My dad, who had been a lawyer, had been a litigator, would argue in court, a very articulate man, turned to somebody to say something one night, and out of his mouth came a whole string of gibberish. The words didn't really make sense, and then I was sitting next to him and kind of was sort of surprised, and he was surprised, and he stopped, and then he started speaking again, and again, what came out of his mouth were sounds and like parts of words, but it didn't make sense what he was saying. And in that instant, in that just as quickly as going from one moment to the next, the brain cancer cells that had been growing in his brain probably for a long time had invaded the language portion of his brain and had made him unable to use words to be able to express himself clearly. And later, the brain cancer spread, and he had a lot of other problems, including problems seeing and problems walking. But it was really in that sudden instant, it just happened that his life was completely changed. And my life was completely changed, and the life of everyone in my family just got turned upside down. And it was not anything that any of us were prepared for. And it was something that was very hard to adjust to. And that was, my dad died about a year later when I was 15. And that really changed my life very considerably. But it was in that first moment when he opened his mouth and out of his mouth came words that didn't make sense, that things, it was like a switch had been flipped. We went from being a normal family to a family that was suddenly dealing with crisis and dealing with caregiving. So that's a little bit about my background and what I bring to this story, to this presentation today. we're going to talk about what is sudden caregiving, and then talk a little bit about how it differs from what I'm calling gradual caregiving, but I think most people think of it as just caregiving. And then when you have that sudden emergency, that sudden change, when that switch is flipped, how do family members who didn't ever think of themselves as caregivers suddenly become caregivers and learn what they need to learn and prepare the way they need to prepare if they can. For all my presentations that I do on caregiver teleconnection, they're usually based on the articles that I write for the AARP website. And so I had written an article earlier this year on sudden caregiving, and there is the link to that, and you'll get the slides for today's presentation later, and you can go to that article if you want to read more. I have plenty of other articles on the AARP website as well. So let's just start off by asking a question, and this is really just to get you folks involved in the conversation. If you're caring for somebody now, and I'm assuming many of you, if not all of you, are, did your relative get ill suddenly or gradually? And that's the first question. And the second question is, if it was sudden, what was that moment like for you when you realized that your relative and your family had changed? And what were you thinking? What were you worrying about at that time? So that's a lot, but is there anybody here who'd be willing to unmute themselves or to use a chat box if you would prefer, and maybe share a little bit about what you have gone through?
Stacy, looks like you're up.
Sure. So I'm actually a regional ombudsman as well, but so I'm here because of that, but I'm also here because I did have to take care of my dad about 7 years ago, and he was diagnosed with cancer, but he didn't tell any of us how bad it was. So when I got down there to help my mom, I was really shocked at what my dad looked like, what he could or couldn't do. And then I was just like, holy crap, this is, worse than I thought. But I guess what I was really worried about at the time was caring for my dad and also making sure that my mom was okay, because I'm an only child. But I've been like in the social work field for a long time, so I feel that I was a little more prepared than maybe most people are for this. So that really did help, but it still is very shocking and like just a sudden wake up call, like, holy cow, there's more things in the world that I need to worry about, more so than maybe going to work or whatever. I need to care for my dad, my parents, make sure I know what's going on with him, what his treatment is, and all that. It's very overwhelming.
Stacy, I thought that was, first of all, thank you very much for sharing, and I thought that was very well said. You said two expressions which I thought really captured it. One was you said "holy crap," and then the second one you said was "holy cow." And I think they both, capture like, oh my God, like what's happened? Like, how did this happen? How do we get here? And then feeling like, all right, what do I got to do? And begin to kind of think in your mind, like, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to handle this? What am I supposed to do to take care of the person who is suffering this illness? And in all those, I imagine that what "holy cow" means is like, wow, I have to deal with, suddenly there's all these things I have to deal with that I wasn't counting on. And that, as you say, Stacy, that's overwhelming. Mm-hmm. Is there anybody else who would be willing?
You have a chat from Shane?
Yeah, thank you. Let me take a look. Thank you. Thank you for everyone for pointing it out. Shane says, my mom was a healthy retired nurse and had a stroke suddenly 3 years ago. Me also being a nurse, my adrenaline kicked in, but it was a shock, and I was still very overwhelmed with the next steps ahead. So Shane, I thank you for sharing this. I'm going to say that, I like most of us in the health profession, we know a little something about what we're supposed to do. And, when you know someone's having a stroke, you need get them to a hospital, to get the drugs to probably try to reverse the stroke as much as possible if they're having an ischemic stroke. But so our professional training kicks in, and it sounds like, for you and for Stacy, you know what you're supposed to do. You know how, like, sort of intellectually in your brain, you know what you're supposed to do. But then there's also this emotional feeling like, holy moly, there's another expression that what am I, what are that not only what are the next steps, but how am I going to handle these next steps? Like, this wasn't what I was counting on. Great. Appreciate it, Shane. Anybody else want to share before I go on?
If you don't mind, if I say something, Barry, I would
love it. Thank you.
That feeling of being overwhelmed. I mean, many of us have been there. I certainly have. And we have full lives when it happens. And we think, how am I going to take care of my family, my house, my stuff, and do all of this?
Yeah, no, it's I keep looking at those waves behind you, and so I'm going to use those waves right now as an analogy. But we have a lot of stress in our lives, and so we have to get to work. We got to pay our bills. We've got to keep our households up. Maybe we get sick. Maybe our tax bill is due. I mean, there are stresses. Like one wave after another of things that we have to deal with. But what we're talking about today is not a little. It's not a wave, a little wave. It's a gigantic wave that seems to come out of the blue and sweep everything aside. Suddenly, it's like that. It's like a tsunami, maybe, or maybe that's a little bit too big. I don't know how big a tsunami would be, but it's not something we're counting on. We can handle those waves behind you, right? We're accustomed to handling those waves. It doesn't always feel good to handle them, but we can handle those stresses. But when suddenly we get hit with a big wave that came out of nowhere, then that knocks us down, and we have to get back up again. Anybody else before we go on? I see another comment. Lori says, adrenaline, of course, completed all tasks, of course. After husband died, traumatic recall, of course, of illness, and frequently ask myself, what happened? How did this happen? So, Lori, that is, I think, the question many of us ask: how do things happen? I mean, we always ask, kind of, how did I asked, how did my dad get brain cancer? I still to this day wonder. I mean, my dad had been in World War II. Was he exposed to things that caused him years later to develop brain cancer? Maybe if your loved one has had a stroke or has had a heart attack, you're wondering, what caused this? And then there's always that question of how could I have handled that moment better? Could I have handled what happened after that moment? And you say, same question for you. Husband diagnosed with glioblastoma, and my dad too had a glioblastoma. So hard questions, and questions that we can't really ever answer fully. You just come up with ideas, but there's still that moment where the air gets sucked out of the room, and we're gasping, or we get hit with that wave, whatever analogy you want to use. So let me go on, and I imagine that what I'm hearing is that most of us on this call understand what this is, and just to kind of describe in a little bit more depth what sudden caregiving is. Our relative is normal. Our family feels normal. Normal means that it is the way it is. It just, it may not be the same as every other family around us, but we have the things that we do every day, and we go about our business. And we're not dealing with life-threatening situations. We're not dealing with significant disabilities as a result of a medical event. But in sudden caregiving, the relative suddenly has a stroke, or they have a heart attack, or maybe they fall down a flight of stairs, or they have a car accident, or some other types of accident, and their spinal cord is severed, and they're dealing with paralysis, and they have to, all of life getting around suddenly becomes much more difficult because they've lost functioning, they've lost independence, and that means they're more dependent on us and other family members. And so all of family life is suddenly upended. All the ways that we expect the day to go, all of the ways we expect our family members to function, all of that changes instantly. And then what often happens in those situations, and I'd be interested to hear from Stacy and Shane and others about what your thoughts were, is the first instinct for most of us in that situation is how can we beat whatever this challenge is, whether it be a stroke or heart attack, and return the family to the way it had been before this event happened. In other words, if we're saying that a switch was flipped and things change, how can we flip that same switch back and return things to where they were? And I'm going to, so there's almost always that wish at first. And then if it's not possible, then what families often go through is a kind of grieving process for grieving the old way, the old normal, and then figuring out what the new normal is going to be. What is my life, my family life going to be like with a dad who can't work anymore because he can't speak intelligibly? What is somebody's life like when their father has a heart attack and he can't do construction work anymore, or someone falls down a flight of steps and has a head injury and suddenly they need much more help. So the first instinct for most of us is how do we reverse what happened? But then in most cases, that's not going to be possible. And then figuring out the way life is going to be. How do we settle into a new kind of life and make that new kind of life a good, satisfying life? That then becomes the challenge. And that's a very hard challenge. So before I go on, anybody have any thoughts or questions about this? Maybe especially this idea that we try at first to go back in time. It's like we want to turn back the clock.
I have a little website for those of you who just joined us. Please feel free to unmute yourself. If you're on the phone, you can press *6 and I'll be able to see that you would like to talk to us. You can use the chat room if you're on Zoom, put your hand up, or just unmute yourself. And Barry, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Do you think sometimes there's also this sense of guilt? Could we have done more? Could we have noticed things sooner? Along with, can I turn it back?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think if someone we care for had a heart attack, then we always are thinking, well, why should I have made him go to the doctor? Should I have made him quit smoking? Should I have made him stop eating, Fritos? Whatever it is, right? It could be anything. But we begin to think of how can we undo this, but how could we have prevented this? So if we could turn the clock back, then we will say, okay, now we'll make sure that if he can recover from his heart attack, then he'll never eat, never smoke, never eat bad things again, never smoke again, etc. And sometimes we kind of bargain with God. We say to God, please help my loved one recover, and we'll make sure that they do right, and then I'll do right. Right? We sometimes take it upon ourselves. I'll go to church or whatever people say. It's all part of that of trying to come to grips with what's happened. So I see a couple of comments in the chat, and I see from Stacy trying to go back to normal. Trying to go back is a normal response for so many people. I agree, Stacy. And Anouk says this kind of challenge in life is for people strong and brave, like in the Bible says, just praying and ask God for love and patience. And I would say that is absolutely the case. People I think the first thing in my experience, in my own personal and professional experiences, people first pray to God to turn the clock back and to undo this, and then maybe when we realize that that's not possible, that for whatever reason we have to live with a relative who's now has certain disabilities, we pray for the love and the patience to be able to be there for them and to be able to make this change and to continue to support them. Shane writes, I had guilt. I felt like I saw that something was unusual earlier that week with my mom and mentioned it to my other siblings. I felt almost upset with them afterwards because they talked me out of taking her in. Shane, that sounds really, really tough. And I'll say what you know, and that is, ultimately it was up to your mom to go in, and that it's not, the responsibility is not on you necessarily. And it sounds to me like, because you're a trained professional, because you're a nurse, your special knowledge almost makes you feel like you have special responsibility to keep, because you can see things, you can observe things that are signs of something brewing. Maybe you had special responsibility, but it could have very easily been that you would have said something not just to your siblings but to your mom, and she would have just said, I'm fine, Shane, don't worry, you always worry too much. But I hear you. I think the guilt is also a very normal feeling, and just as everyone says, we all kind of think back in time, how could we have prevented this? Okay, let me go forward. So I think we already have a sense of this, but let me just spell this out. So I'm making a distinction between sudden and gradual caregiving. And so when we think about caregiving, probably the type of caregiving we think about most often is dementia. And that's certainly what gets the most publicity. And many of us are probably caring for people with dementia. I cared for people with dementia. And then so that is, dementia is a neurological condition. And another fairly common neurological condition is Parkinson's disease. And for those of you who are not familiar with Parkinson's disease, it's when people begin to lose control over their muscles, like they get very rigid, or they become what's called hyperkinetic. They can't control their movements very well. The brain loses the capacity to manage movement, and people have a very difficult time ultimately walking. They have what's called a shuffling gait. They shuffle all the time. They're very apt to fall. And the thing about these neurological conditions is these types of neurological conditions have a gradual onset. From the time that someone is diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, they usually live another 7 to 8 years, and gradually decline over those 7 to 8 years. Alzheimer's dementia, has this long arc, and that makes it very, very hard, because it requires caregiving for a very long period of time. But the challenge for most people with who's caring for someone with Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease or MS or many other neurological conditions is that at first we don't even recognize that our relative is beginning to undergo changes, or if we notice it, we tend to kind of push him aside, like, he's always a little forgetful, it's not a big deal, or he's always kind of had a little bit of a shuffling gait, I'm not going to worry about that. But it takes a while to, number one, recognize that there is this problem, and that these diseases, make no bones about it, they have a devastating impact on the individual and the family, and caregiving is very hard. But when you're dealing with a gradual onset illness, everyone in the family has more time, and that's time to come to grips with the diagnosis, to talk about what the best thing is to do, to organize caregiving plans, to learn about resources in your community, to really adjust to this unfolding caregiving situation. And that is no small advantage. That's the difference between having being hit sideways by a wave versus seeing it coming a long way off, and maybe having the chance to get to higher ground, or to build some sort of fortification But here, this is when it hits, it's going to hit and it's going to have an impact. But the family has time to adapt, and that's not true in sudden caregiving. So, and I'm really using every kind of metaphor and analogy I can grab here. So to me, it's like the difference between, sudden caregivers are, as the expression goes, thrown into the deep end of the pool, and gradual caregivers waded slowly. And both of them have to learn how to swim because ultimately the water is going to be above their heads. And they need to learn to swim to prevent drowning. But that person who's thrown in the deep end of the pool, they got to learn a whole lot faster. Otherwise, they will sink and drown. So, any thoughts before I go on?
For those of you who are on the phone, you can press *6. I can see that you have done that. For those of you who are on Zoom, please, you can unmute yourself, put your hand up, go to the chat room.
So I'll go on. I'll actually just stop and pause and describe my family's experience. When my dad suddenly spoke with a lot of gibberish, my mother's first thought was he was having a stroke, and called the doctors. And I think at that time they didn't take him to the hospital until the next morning, where he underwent all kinds of tests. But there was this period of like something terrible has happened, but we don't quite know what it is. And then when it turned out that it was cancer, then the question was, okay, again, how do we reverse this? How do we beat the cancer? How do, what chemotherapy is he going to need? What radiation therapy is he going to need? And then, but this, so everything initially felt like we were in this emergency, which was a temporary emergency. We're all going to have to do what we need to do to get through that. And I was a teenager, my first year of high school, but there was things that I had to do and my younger brother had to do. But there was this thought, okay, we'll get through this, and then we'll go back to the way we were. And it took months before we realized that, at least as two young teenagers, my brother and I, that was not going to happen. That my father's condition, at the very least, was going to impair him forever. And then in my family situation, my father declined quickly enough that he died. But we went through, it was these stages of that I would say first shock, and then just believing that this was a temporary situation, and then really coming to this terrible realization that this wasn't temporary, and then having to begin to grieve the old life, and then with a lot of uncertainty about what our lives were going to be like then, and then actually adapting to this new routine to support my father as he declined the best we could. And that was a several-month process, which many family members struggle with. There are families who, never come to this idea that for instance, to use an example of a stroke, that if when someone has a stroke, we know that they're going to make the most recovery from the stroke in the first 6 months after they have a stroke, and then generally up to about 2 years following the stroke. From 6 months to 2 years, they'll have more gradual recovery. So there's always this hope, like, okay, well, if someone's had a stroke, well, maybe they're going to get back their ability to walk. Maybe they're going to get back their ability to use their right arm if the right arm was paralyzed as a result of the stroke. Maybe they're going to be able to go back, fully recover and go back to the way they were, even though we know only about 10% of people who have strokes ever fully recover from it. But it takes a long time for people to eventually come to the realization that even if my loved one gets some recovery, they're not going to get all the recovery I would hope that they would, and they're not going to be exactly the way they were, and we're not going to be exactly the way we were as a family. So that's a kind of waiting period. It's a kind of purgatory that we are in before we realize what what life is now going to be. Thoughts about that at all? Anybody who could reflect a little bit on that, what that experience was like for them, making that that it may have been a sudden caregiving event, but there was a kind of a gradual adjustment to this new normal.
Anybody like to talk to us?
Is that ringing bells for anybody, or is what I'm saying, does it just sound a little off from your experience?
Barry, all I can say is thank you for sharing your personal.
Evelyn, I appreciate that, and what I always say is what happened in my family when I was that young kind of led me to do what I've done for 40 years as a psychologist. I mean, I do this work because of what happened in my family. So it's kind of hard to separate my life from what happened at that time.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll go on. So let me just ask another general question for you. So what kind of skills do you think a sudden caregiver might need that are different from those that are required for gradual caregiving? And I see a comment from Sonia. Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Sonia. Anyway, what kind of skills? I mean, so I Stacy and Shane, you've been very generous with who's made comments. How did you adapt? I mean, that's really what I'm asking here. How did you figure out that you had to adapt? And then how did you figure out how to go about it? And so Shane has put it in the chat, support from friends and family. And I'm wondering, Shane, would you be interested in unmuting and just kind of talking what that was like for you? How did you even, number one, how did you know that you needed support? And I guess two, did you know at the beginning that your mom was not going to fully recover from the stroke? I don't know that, but I'm assuming that. And then what was it like to turn to friends and family for support? Because a lot of us don't like to turn to anybody for support. We much rather support other people and not need support ourselves.
Good morning. Being a nurse and knowing what type of stroke she had a hemorrhagic stroke, and it was pretty severe. I knew right away that she probably wouldn't ever fully recover, but I had siblings and family who didn't understand what the stroke meant. And it was kind of hard because it was like tug of war. They were like, if she gets more therapy, she'll be better. She can walk again. And she did full therapy. It was really hard. I think that sudden caregivers need that support. I don't feel like I had it right away. I have it now, but it was very difficult being the one who was like making all the decisions and knew kind of what her prognosis was. And the others are like, oh no, she's going to be fine. And just give her more time. It was very hard to like help them to understand that no, we have to adjust to a new normal. She's never going to be the same way she was.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that, Shane. And what I'm hearing, and I believe you, is that to be the bearer of bad news in a family it's not comfortable. That, because people want to hold on to hope, then if you're telling them that no, we have to prepare for mom not being able to walk again, they don't want to hear that. And then they are, then maybe they might even go so far as to tell you don't know what you're talking about, right? Just because you're a nurse, you think you know everything.
Absolutely. I got that a lot. Just because you've been a nurse for all these years, you don't know. It was hard. It was very hard.
I mean, so that, I think what you're telling us is that because your siblings were themselves having difficulty adjusting to this new reality, then it was easier for them to kind of dismiss what you were saying, or even minimize what you were saying as a way of protecting themselves from having to deal with the reality. And that's a very difficult place for a family caregiver to be. And that happens, as you know, with dementia too. I mean, someone says, I think mom has dementia, and everyone else in the family says, mom is fine. Why are you trying to take over her life? Right? That's a lot of the ways people adapt, struggle with adapting to these changes which are occurring. None of us like change all that much, especially really negative changes like dementia or a stroke. So what I'm hearing, Shane, is you had to be patient with other people at first. Otherwise, you could have felt really hurt by some of the things they were saying. And then it sounds like later on you were able to get the support that you needed. Anybody else feel like sharing kind of what it was like for you? How do you think sudden caregiving, what skills does a sudden caregiver need that are different from those for gradual caregiving?
Stacy would like to talk. She has an open line.
Yeah, I think that you need to be, you have to have a thick skin because you're going to get yelled at by like family members or, other people that don't agree with what you're saying. You need to be organized because you need to kind of have a plan of what you're going to do. I think too that I reached out to family and friends, even when I didn't feel like talking, when I was upset or tired, just to talk to somebody and to let them listen to me, even like a friend that maybe had never like met my parents, and just to be able to vent about, how my dad was and what he was saying or doing. Because I knew at that time that wasn't my dad when he would get mad and yell or whatever. But just to have somebody there to listen and not, say anything and just listen to you and know that they're there for you and you're not doing this alone. And no matter what you tell them, they're not going to judge you if you yelled back at your dad or got upset or walked out or whatever too. That was really helpful to me.
I'm glad people were there for you, Stacy. And it sounds like you realized early on that you needed that, and the situation was pretty tough, and your dad was not being your dad. He was being, his personality had been changed, or either by the stress of the situation or actually by the brain tumor that it was affecting his personality and the way he behaved. It sounds to me like you realized very early on that you needed support and reached out for it, and people were there for you. Any other thoughts before we go on? So I want to say, just to kind of describe this sudden caregiving situation again. And I mentioned that I had written an article about sudden caregiving on the AARP website recently. So here, this is from the article, and what I wrote is: sudden caregiving confronts caregivers with so many novel challenges, it often engenders helplessness. Caregivers flounder, sometimes struggling to give up their old routines, sometimes unsure of which new routines are the right ones to provide the best help. While many learn on the job, muddling through caregiving tasks uncertainly, others try to empower themselves by going into caregiver training. So one of the first things that people do when they're kind of suddenly thrown in the deep end of the pool here is they have to learn what is going on. They've never dealt with stroke before, then they got to learn what a stroke is. And you heard Shane use the term hemorrhagic stroke, which is a type of stroke where someone has a bleed in the brain, and that is different than what is called an ischemic stroke, or an embolic stroke, where somebody has a blockage within the blood vessel. And an ischemic, the recovery is a little different. Some of the symptoms initially may be the same, but there are also differences between those two strokes. That's not something that most of us know until we deal with stroke. So, and unfortunately, what happens is, if we have a sudden medical emergency, almost all of us are overwhelmed. And when we feel overwhelmed, when we're feeling high anxiety, then that's not usually when our brain is in the best state to learn new information. As a matter of fact, it's the worst state to learn new information. So suddenly we're thrown into the situation. Maybe we've rushed to the emergency room. Maybe we've come home from across the country to care for somebody, and our anxiety is very high, and we're being hit with all this new information. Here's what the condition is. Here's what a stroke is. Here's what a brain tumor is. Here are so here are the treatments. Here are the medications. Here are the limitations that your loved one has now. Here is what to expect with the disease. That's a lot of new information for the brain to have to absorb. And then the question that most people in that situation have is, can we, as I keep mentioning, can we reverse this? But also, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do to help? So it's very important, number one, for caregivers, sudden caregivers, to expose themselves to this information, but also realize that they're not going to absorb it all at once, as efficiently as they usually do. But they need to get on that website for, whether it be the American Stroke Association or even the Alzheimer's Association, if you're dealing with Alzheimer's disease, and you begin to read and you begin to understand as much as you can handle emotionally. You begin to take in as much as you can, knowing you're going to have to go back to that website probably multiple times, maybe reread the same web pages again and again in order to really absorb the information, because it just takes a while for it to get in and to really help you come to this point of saying, okay, things have really changed, and life is going to be different now. I know, and Evelyn was saying before we started today that she used to be a hospital social worker going to the emergency room. And I as a psychologist, I used to work in hospitals as well. And I know that when physicians talk with family members, in a patient's room, when there's been a medical emergency, the doctors know that the families are not going to take in much information. So they'll go back again and repeat it, or they'll have the social worker go back and repeat it, because they know that it's just going to take a while for people to take that information in. But this idea of, okay, I have to learn, because that's what's going to be required to really be as helpful as I can right now. That's very important. Have other people kind of purposely decided, okay, my relative has this condition, I better learn about this condition? I mean, does the information just come to you? The doctor just hand it to you, or do you go looking for it? Or maybe at the beginning you don't want to hear the information because it's just too much. Evelyn, in your work, what has your experience been?
Well, there's lots of different reactions. Some people get really angry right away. Some people fight with their relatives because they find out that they didn't get the house in the will. People can be rough. People can be mean. It's just such a difficult psychosocial time for them. And certainly, one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is support groups. And those are incredibly helpful, because we find out that we're not alone, that other people have, the same issues, just like Shane and Stacy and Lori have talked to us. They're like a support group here for everyone else on the line, because people experience the same kinds of emotions and reactions, and it's a tough job. And I know you wanted to make this a fun presentation.
Yeah, no, it's not feeling fun right now, is it?
So I would just say, the other thing we need to do is to keep our sense of humor about ourselves, about our relatives, about the situation, about the medical staff. I've worked in the emergency room when there's, a hideous heart attack, the guy dies, the doctor goes in, spends 20 minutes before he tells the wife that the guy's dead.
Mm.
And then he goes out and he's cracking jokes. And the family comes to me and they say, this isn't funny, but it's their way of dealing with it. So we all deal with it differently. It's a tough job.
Yeah, it's a very tough job. I mean, for families, for healthcare providers, it's these, high stress situations like this don't always bring out the best in people, unfortunately. But I heard you mention a number of things that I want to underscore, that when people are ready, go into support groups, help people feel less alone, provide the support that we heard Shane and others reach out for. And also people learn a lot about the disease and about treatments and about the healthcare system when they go to support groups. They listen to what other people's experiences have been, and they learn through listening to those experiences. So this is all, again, part of getting accustomed to this new normal and taking care of yourself in this new normal. I'm going to skip this question. Along the same lines, and I think this fits in with the support group idea, is a lot of times when people are feeling in the beginning anxious and overwhelmed, to be able to turn to somebody quickly for answers and having some way of reducing the anxiety, reducing the overwhelming feeling they have, that's very important. To have someone who's maybe walked in those shoes before, maybe someone else who's dealt with stroke or dealt with a brain injury or brain tumor before, or having even a healthcare professional serve that role. It could be friends, family members, neighbors, healthcare professionals. It doesn't necessarily just have to be a doctor. There are lots of people who could serve this role. And I'm wondering, for those of you who've been some caregivers, did anybody have someone that they could turn to, like, to serve as a personal guide, someone who knew the territory, could kind of guide you through a little bit?
You can open up your phones, use the chat room, press *6 if you're on the phone. We'd love to hear from you.
Or, if you didn't have a personal guide, did you feel alone? Did you feel that you were just struggling to figure this out on your own?
Had no one to turn to.
Yeah. I think I bummed everyone out. So I bummed them out into silence.
Well, I don't think that's what happened. It's just, okay, so Shane felt alone for the first couple of years, and look at her now.
Yeah.
She's able to share all this and support other people in their walk through it.
Yeah,
So,
thank you very much, Shane.
Yeah.
Well, I would say we all have personal guides in this. It would be great. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. So having someone who's maybe a family where someone's dealt with a heart attack before is very, very helpful. Lori says, joined a support group of those who are caregivers for cancer patients, found it very helpful, decided I wasn't going to be accountable to anyone but myself. Would love to hear more about what you meant, what you mean by the last thing you wrote, Lori, if you'd be willing to unmute. But what do you mean you decided you weren't going to be accountable to anyone but yourself? I know I'm putting you on the spot, and if you're comfortable unmuting, that would be great. If not, I understand. Okay, I'm going to go on, but Lori, interrupt me at any point. So, Evelyn and I were also talking about this, how important it is for all of us, as much as possible, to prepare for things in advance, right? But obviously, when we suddenly hit with an emergency, we deal with the emergency. It would be so wonderful if we had some preparation beforehand. And the way we prepare in our society is we do several things. We fill out a will in the event of our death. We fill out a living will in the event that maybe at some point we're going to be incapacitated to not be able to speak for ourselves. And maybe sometimes people even have discussions about the way they want the family to handle things, how they want the family to handle things financially, or they say, if anything happens to me, please take care of your mom. But there are those conversations so that people have some idea of what to expect when caregiving suddenly arrives. And I'm going to tell you another personal story. So my brother, some years ago, his wife had an aneurysm in her brain, burst, and she had a severe bleed in her brain, in the brainstem area, And even after neurosurgery, she did not survive. She died within about a day and a half, 2 days. The year before, my brother and his wife had filled out living wills, in which my sister-in-law had explicitly in her living will that she didn't want heroic measures to keep her alive. And she also agreed that she would be an organ donor. And having that document made my brother's terrible situation just a little bit better, because he could, with good conscience, tell the doctors to turn off the respirator after a certain amount of time and agree to donate her organs, because she had already put those things in writing as what she wanted in the event of an emergency like this. So all of us should have a will. All of us should have a living will. Only about 45% of Americans have a will, and only about 35% of Americans have a living will. A living will, sometimes called an advance directive, basically, again, says medically and financially what you want to happen in the event that you're not able to speak for yourself because of a medical emergency. So these documents are really, really important to help prepare for at least some of the aspects of an emergency. Nancy says, thanks so much for all you've shared today. I need to leave for another meeting. Nancy, thank you so much for joining. I appreciate you joining us.
And Lori did get a chance to open up her phone. I don't know if she's still around. Yes,
Hello.
she. Hello.
Hi. Yeah, Barry asked me to expand a little on my comment about not being accountable to anyone but myself. I had a family member of my late husband ask me something about how I was doing, and I made a comment that I had been going to a support group, and I expected her to say something along the lines of, oh, well, that's good, or, something like that. And her comment was, oh, I didn't know you were that upset about it. And this was 3 months after my husband died. And I was like speechless. I didn't know what to say. I got really angry.
But you didn't slap her.
No, but I really wanted to. And I just sort of quickly regrouped and said, I find it very helpful. And that's all I said. And I thought, when your husband gets a fatal brain tumor diagnosis, you can handle it however you would like. This is what I'm doing. And of course, I didn't
She'll
say
be calling you and asking you for us to be her model.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then, other people said things that were meant to be helpful, but they were not. I don't remember all of them, but that's the one I do remember. And it was it's just another reflection of our society. We are ill prepared to talk about death. Everyone gets squeamish about it. It does happen to all of us. Nobody gets out of here alive. It's always tragic, no matter what. And I just decided I was going to feel my pain in my own pace, in my own way, and I'll find a way back out of it, which I have, although it's still there. It just changes.
Laura, thank you so much for sharing so openly, and I understand better now what you mean about you're only accountable to yourself. You gotta be true to yourself and do this your way and not have to answer to other people at all. So really appreciate you sharing that with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah, and Shane has put that thank you as well in the chat.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. We have about 5 minutes left.
You have about 2 minutes left. I have stuff I have to do.
All right, very good. So with the 2 minutes we have left, I'm going to stop sharing and see if there's anything else anybody would like to ask or talk about before I turn it back over to Evelyn. I guess I promised fun, and this was decidedly not fun. I'm not feeling very, very fun at the moment. I mean, thinking about my own family emergency, which in my case was about 50 years ago, and it's still, I mean, even 50 years later, it's sort of like it just brings up a lot of terror, a lot of feelings of, oh my Lord, terrible things can happen sometimes. So,
but look at the people you've helped today.
Well, I appreciate that. And Shane, I think I appreciate your comment. And you say it was a little triggering for you too. But I appreciate that that this presentation was helpful. Anyone else have a question or last thought before I turn it over to Evelyn to wrap up?
Just thank you so much. You did a beautiful job.
Oh, well, thank you so much for saying that, Evelyn. I appreciate it.
And thank all of you who participated. It makes our presentation so much richer. That makes the podcast so much better. And I think people, when you really get down to your examples, that's when people really listen. Nobody can help a caregiver like another caregiver. I would like to say that I am myself and planning on, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I don't think I even introduced myself, sorry. I'm planning on doing a care planning session next month on November 27th. It's Monday. And there's so much online now. There are so many links to official documents like wills, living wills, financial, planning forms, how to learn about a disease. I mean, there's so much information out there available. So I'll be talking about a lot of that and about a checklist that you need to plan for the future. And the planning needs to start today, especially if you want the people who are going to be involved to tell you what they want. Because that, like Barry was telling us, the fact that his sister-in-law was able to say what she wanted, it makes things so much easier. It makes the future, for those who live on so much better. So talking about it, bringing the family together, making decisions, doing some problem solving, looking at the finances, talking about, well, what if they do need placement? Should we go look at some places? All of those things. And it can be over time. It can be, that you make different decisions every month or every 2 months about what the plan should hold. But having that plan is going to make you less stressed. It's going to make the whole family less stressed. Because as we age, we know stuff happens. I was really thinking of that other word for stuff, but I don't know if that's appropriate here. So, Barry, you did a beautiful job. And I'm sure people aren't depressed. They feel, empowered. And that's really what matters. I do want to tell people we've got 3 sessions left on this month. We've got one next, tomorrow on stress management by Elliot Montgomery Sklar and Lucy Darlock. They're working on Our Health is Our Wealth, and that's a health promotion series for caregivers. They've done nutrition, physical activity, and mental health, and stress management is a big one for caregivers. And all of those, the ones that I mentioned, they've already done are on podcasts if you'd like to listen to those. Tomorrow, we have Dr. Jamie Heisman, who is going to talk on taking off your mask. And he's talked a little bit about this before and about how we present to people the way we often think they want us to present rather than being who we are. And I think that's a lot of what some of our caregivers have said today. We need to be who we are and take care of ourselves. And then we have one next Tuesday, healthy eating in the holidays. We have somebody who's a specialist in diets and who's going to tell us how to balance that bad stuff with some good stuff. So we wind up at the end of the holidays feeling good about ourselves. So with that, I just want to say to everyone, please, we're going to send you a post-session questionnaire. We ask you to fill it out. It will have Barry's slides with it and his resources. We also will send the monthly calendar to those of you who are registered. And if you're not registered, you won't get the resources nor the post-session questionnaire. So I'm going to give you the phone number to get registered. And that number is 866-390-6491. 866-390-6491. And you'll get the monthly calendar. We also have, WellMed Charitable Foundation has in cahoots with other agencies, is having a caregiver summit at 10 o'clock on November 9th at Central Time, 10 to 1. Finding Balance in Your Journey is the name of the summit. and they've got some big time professional people who are going to be presenting. And they're also doing it again in Spanish on the 16th of November at the same time slot, 10 to 1. And we will put that on the website. You will get that with your resources. And if you don't get it, please just call that number, 866-390-6491, and get signed up for that and registered for the Caregiver Summit. And you don't need to go to it. You'll be able to see it online. So with that, I want to thank Barry so much for the beautiful presentation and your preparation and your personal story. I want to thank the caregivers for theirs. And I want to thank the WellMed Charitable Foundation for all of that they are doing for caregivers. And I'm going to stop the recording now and thank you all. Hope you have a great day.
Thanks all. Good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.